Bismillahir Rahmanir Rahim. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullah, and welcome to a new session of the Ummatics Colloquium, a special session we're having on Bangladesh in light of the recent revolutionary events that took place. This week's session is entitled Bangladesh's Revolution, Challenges, Opportunities and the Umma, and we bring together some wonderful expertise from around the world, and we're very honored to have you all here. So a bit of background, the 5th of August of this month, the 5th of this month in 2024, which corresponded with the first day of Safar in 1446, witnessed the end of a dark decade and a half in Bangladesh's history. This large Muslim majority country, the third in ranking in the planet, has since 2009 been under the increasingly autocratic rule of a now former autocrat, Sheikh Hasina, and her Awami League political party. Over 15 years, she used the state's institutions to decimate any opposition to her rule, arrest, execute, or exile her critics, and transform Bangladesh into a de facto one-party state. No one could have predicted earlier this summer that student protests against a relatively obscure but far-reaching quota system for desirable government jobs would have resulted in her ouster in a matter of weeks. Blinded by her seemingly absolute power, she underestimated the degree of anger felt by the country at the vicious crackdowns she had brought to bear on protesters. Her authoritarian instincts could not quell the righteous indignation of the students and their supporters, of whom hundreds had died in the police and security forces' crackdowns. 3 days after her flight to India on the 5th of August, on 8th August, Bangladesh's only Nobel Prize winner, Dr. Muhammad Yunus, a Western-educated banker, was installed under army supervision as the head of an interim caretaker government. The 84-year-old Yunus was the choice of the student protesters and is seen as a clean pair of hands, taking the helm of a country whose institutions have been severely compromised by the corrupting influences of 15 years of Awami League rule. This month's Ummatics Colloquium thus addresses the events in Bangladesh, bringing together 3 scholars and activists from two from the country and one from a country that has also experienced revolution in the past decade and a half, but has experienced democratic backsliding. In this moment of hope and considerable risks, we will explore the ummatic implications of recent events in the country, with the abortive 2011 uprising still fresh in our memories, as well as the challenge of authoritarian orders dominating much of the Ummah's post-colonial political formations. Inshallah, we'll address a series of questions which I hope to come to in the course of this discussion. But I want to first introduce our 3 august and distinguished speakers. The first of our speakers is Dr. Mahmudur Rahman, who is a prominent figure in Bangladeshi political life with notable achievements in a number of fields. He is one of the owners and the acting editor of the Bengali daily newspaper Amar Desh. Beyond journalism, Mahmudur Rahman has a background in engineering and business that allowed him in the early 2000s to serve as the executive chairman of the National Investment Board and later became the National Energy Advisor for the Bangladesh government. Since 2008, he has been a vocal critic of the government through his newspaper, leading to numerous defamation and sedition cases against him. This is one of the mechanisms used by the former authoritarian government of Sheikh Hasina. And the sedition cases have been characterized, or these various cases have been characterized by international human rights groups as judicial harassment. Mahmudur Rahman is the author of several books in Bangla and English, the latest of which is The Political History of Muslim Bengal, written in English, and the subtitle is The Unfinished Battle of Faith. He is the first of our speakers, and inshallah I would like to welcome him to speak, and I will introduce the remaining speakers over the course of the afternoon or morning, as may be the case for some of you. I also want to say that each of our speakers, inshallah, will speak for 10 to 15 minutes, and so we'll take your opening statements in turn on the current circumstances in Bangladesh, and you're bringing your own experience to bear on that. And following that, we welcome questions from the audience, but we'll be going into a discussion for hopefully about an hour following this, and hopefully this will be a very informative discussion, thinking about the ummatic dimensions of this revolution, as many are calling it. In fact, in that spirit, I just want to highlight one set of questions that I have in mind, which can inform your initial deliberations, but hopefully is something that we will think about as we approach the discussion. That how can the wider Ummah contribute to Bangladesh's flourishing in what we hope will be a new dawn of a more prosperous era? And can an ummatic lens be drawn on to elicit a greater sense of responsibility towards Bangladesh on the part of other states? And also a question would be, does Bangladesh, what sort of role does Bangladesh itself perhaps see as having in the context of the wider Ummah? So this is, of course, part of the raison d'etre of the Ummatics Colloquium and the Ummatics Institute. But without further ado, I'd like to welcome the distinguished scholar and entrepreneur, Dr. Mahmudur Rahman, to the floor. Ahlan wa sahlan.
Rahim. Assalamu alaikum. Let me start my deliberation with a brief description of South Asia to understand the geopolitics of the region. South Asia is the largest region in the world in terms of population, where about 1.95 billion people live, nearly 1 in 4 of the world's population. It's huge. And there are 8 countries in South Asia. Out of the 8 countries, 4 are Muslim majority, which are Pakistan, Bangladesh, Afghanistan, and Maldives. 2 are Hindu majority, India and Nepal. And 2 are Buddhist majority, Sri Lanka and Bhutan. And out of these 8 countries, since 1947, I mean, immediately after the British colonial ruler exited from the subcontinent, India wanted to assume the role of the regional hegemon. Absolute. They wanted to establish absolute hegemonic control. And Pakistan became the challenger of that hegemonic aspiration. And out of the 8 countries, I mean, in total, and 7 countries, excluding India, India has been successful in imposing hegemony over Bhutan through signing a so-called friendship treaty in 1949. And according to that treaty, Bhutan is actually under the hegemonic rule of India, like the classical Greek hegemony. For example, Bhutan hasn't got yet diplomatic relationship with any of the 5 permanent members of the United Nations. United States, France, England, Russia, and China, because Delhi doesn't want it. So all its foreign policy and foreign policy activities are controlled from Delhi. This is one. And out of the other 6 countries, India succeeded to establish hegemonic control, although informally, over Bangladesh for a period of nearly 15 years, through imposition of a puppet regime, which has been ousted very recently by August Revolution. Now, during the last 16 years, the Bangladeshi people, they suffered tremendously. I mean, they were victims of extrajudicial killing and enforced disappearance, arbitrary arrests and torture in custody. All sorts of crime against humanity have been committed by the ousted fascist regime of Sheikh Hasina. Bangladesh was once a democratic country. It was one of the very few countries where a democratic system of governance was there from 1991 until 2006. There were 3 very transparent elections, and people choose their own parties, own leaders, and it was doing fine. But as in a world, in a unipolar world since post 9/11, Bangladesh has become a victim because of the American policy under President Bush, with us or against us policy. And with that policy, what the American administration did, they actually allowed India to become the undeclared ruler of South Asia, because they declared that India will be the strategic partner of US in its fight against China and against so-called Islamic terrorism. So India took full advantage of this, and they established a puppet regime in Bangladesh under Sheikh Hasina. Now, the problem is this: the people were were fighting against this oppression, but the Western countries, they were more or less silent initially, at least until 2019. America was more or less silent on the persecutions of the people by the fascist regime, because India was taking its brief to the Western capitals in Washington, in London, in Brussels, everywhere, and India was telling to its Western friends that they need their eastern neighbor, that means Bangladesh, to be a subservient state for the sake of their own security and for the sake of controlling the rise of Islamism or rise of Islamic political parties in the whole region. So for that reason, Bangladesh suffered a lot. And prior to this revolution, this wonderful revolution in the month of August, actually the people were struggling. They were fighting against the government. So many people died. I mean, more than 1,000 people became the victim of enforced disappearances, and more than, I think, 5,000 people were victims of extrajudicial killings. So, I mean, every time when the government was in trouble, they used maximum coercive power of the state to control the situation. And as because the Western world, because of their understanding of their of politics in geopolitics in South Asia, that they need India in their fight against China, they remained silent about the Indian hegemonic role in Bangladesh. Under that situation, there was a fantastic revolution that has taken place in July and August. It is not only August; actually, it started in July. And in this struggle, which was about 3 to 4 weeks, the total duration of the revolution was about 3 to 4 weeks. There was a certain time, there was a turning moment in this revolution. And one of the turning moment was 19th of July. In 19th of July, a young student, his name is Abu Saeed, he sacrificed his life. It was an iconic moment in the history of Bangladesh. What happened actually, they were demonstrating against the police, and this young man, Abu Saeed, was there, and he just challenged the police with outstretched hand and in front of the rifles of the police. But the police started firing, and he stood there. He was hit first, fell down on the ground, and then he stood up, and again he was shot. Again he fell down, and he twice fell down and stood, and again stood up to challenge the hegemonic, to challenge this barbarous attack. But finally, he succumbed and he became a martyr. And that was the iconic moment, and that was the turning point. It's similar to what in 2010, what happened in Tunisia. Bouazizi, the self-immolation of Bouazizi started the Arab Spring in Tunisia. So it was in certain aspect, it was similar to that, but I think it was more courageous. It was not a self-immolation. It was as if challenging the brutal force of the regime, unarmed. I mean, it was a fantastic protest. I think this picture will remain as an iconic picture of any revolution for the 21st century. I mean, I remember when we were young people, we were talking of Che Guevara as the eternal rebel, Che Guevara, eternal revolutionary Che Guevara. I think for the Islamic Umma, Dr. Usama was talking about the Umma. I think for the Islamic Umma, Abu Said should be the new hero of revolution, Abu Said. I hope so. Now, think about whether this revolution is going to be successful or it will fail like Arab Spring. So there I have to look into the geopolitics. We have to understand that the fallen dictator is now in India, and she has taken refuge in India. She is under Indian protection now. And I don't think that India will take these laws very easily, because in the history of in the regional politics, this is the greatest disaster for the Indian foreign policy in the whole region. I mean, people can say that they were defeated. The Indian hegemony was also defeated in Sri Lanka in the late 1990s, when it was defeated by the Tamil Tigers there, and the Indian army had to return to India after a defeat at the hand of the Tamil Tigers in Sri Lanka. In the case of Nepal also, Nepal actually defeated the Indian hegemonic design, although Nepal is a very small country. And in Afghanistan also, we know that after the fall of Hamid Karzai, it was not Hamid Karzai government, I mean, Ghani. After the fall of the Ghani government, the Indian intelligence people had to flee from Afghanistan along with the American troops. But in the case of Bangladesh, they invested much more than what they invested. Investment means I'm not talking about the economic investment. I am talking about the strategic investment. So they invested much more in Bangladesh than in comparison to Afghanistan or in Sri Lanka. So their investment of 16 years, I mean, in every single state institutions, Indian agents are there in Bangladesh. So it's a huge loss. For time being, they will wait and see how things move in Bangladesh, and then I have a feeling that they will try to make a comeback in the politics of Bangladesh. Because if Bangladesh becomes truly independent, then not only Indian economy will be at a loss, because Bangladesh has become a economic sort of a place where India is earning a lot from Bangladesh by way of exporting their products to Bangladesh, and also by way of exporting their manpower. Bangladesh is the third largest remittance provider for India. Unthinkable. A small country like Bangladesh is giving so much money to India. So it's a big loss to Indian economy. But more than that, it is a huge loss to the Indian military establishment and its strategic vision of South Asia. Because we don't have time to talk about the geography in a much clearer way. There is a so-called chicken neck in Bangladesh which connects India, China, and Bangladesh, which is a very narrow corridor. Now, because of the previous government, India got the right of a corridor, of a so-called transit. Actually, it is a corridor to move its military and its armaments through Bangladesh. Now, with the present government in power, and hopefully that they will retain their sovereignty, they will stop these Indian vehicles to move around Bangladesh. That chicken neck becomes vulnerable to any Chinese attack in future. So strategically, it is a tremendous defeat for India. So I don't think they are going to take it lightly, and they will try to create a situation where they can make a comeback. So we have to be very careful about it. And the success of this revolution depends, according to my understanding, it depends on smooth and timely transfer to the democratic system of governance. Unfortunately, among the Muslim nations, there are only a few countries where really democracy is, they have democratic system. If we count, maybe there are only 5 or 6 countries in the Islamic Umma where there are democratic governance. So Bangladesh was one of them. Once it was for 15 years, it was a democratic country. But now we have another opportunity to return to democracy. So the main success of this government depends on 2 things. One is return to democracy. We must have a credible election where people can choose their own leaders and own party, and that party should rule the country. This is one. And second, we must regain our sovereignty. That is very important. And that, I don't know whether how long this government is going to function, because I expect that this government or the next elected government, they will review all the agreements signed by the previous fascist regime, the fallen regime, with India, because all of these agreements are against the interest of Bangladesh. And many of the agreements are, in fact, not only against the economy of Bangladesh, they are against the sovereignty of Bangladesh. So this is very important. So I would expect that this government will form a committee, an independent commission, to review all these agreements and then take decision which agreement we should keep and which agreement we should scrap. So it depends on the political will and the political strength of the government in power, whether they have the power to challenge the Indian hegemon and tell to them that whatever agreements the fallen regime has signed with India, if they are against the interest of Bangladesh, then the government is going to scrap it. So this will be a big test for the strength and the intention of the current government. So as far as I'm concerned, two things are very important. One is returning to the democratic form of government, maybe within next 1 year. I would expect maybe another 2 years, but definitely we need to return to democracy. And secondly, we have to review all our agreement with India and, if necessary, scrap those agreements. So I think I stop there with my initial intervention. If necessary, I am ready to answer if there are questions from the audience. Thank you very much.
Jazakumullah khairan, Dr. Mahmudur Rahman. That really, you've set an excellent example for all of us in terms of timing. That was exactly 15 minutes, so Jazakumullah khairan. You raised a number of very important questions, but the two central points that you raised, you concluded on, were the return of democracy and managing a long history of Indian hegemony, which is, I think, something that Bangladesh, as part of a wider Umma, needs to be seen as something of an ummatic responsibility, because if Bangladesh is seen as part of an Umma, then India is actually smaller than Bangladesh. But if it's seen as just Bangladesh by itself, then it can be easily dominated. And I think we should interact with neighbors as peers rather than as vassal states and hegemons, as it were, in an ideal scenario. So Jazakumullah khairan for your initial intervention. I'm going to now invite Dr. Tanzeen Doha, who is a scholar with whom I wish I had sort of had greater opportunity to interact when I was living in the United States, but we did meet briefly in Berkeley, California, around a decade ago now. But Dr. Tanzeen Doha is now visiting assistant professor of anthropology at the University of Pittsburgh. He is the founder and general editor of the journal / magazine Milestones, Commentary on the Islamic World, along with being the founder and host of the podcast Everything is Fire. I like your taste in names, mashallah. He holds a PhD in anthropology from the University of California, Davis, and was, quote, Global Racial Justice, unquote, postdoctoral fellow at the Ainodi Center of International Studies at Cornell University. The floor is yours, inshallah, for the next 10 to 15 minutes. Barakallahu feekum. I'm sorry, I can't hear your sound. Sorry.
Can you hear me now?
Yes.
A'udhu billahi minash shaitanir rajim. Bismillahir rahmanir rahim. Assalamu alaikum to all the guests and for the invitation from Ummatics, and thank you, Osama, for the nice introduction. I'd like to actually first immediately mention that it's a great honor for me to be in the same panel as our dear brother Mahmudur Rahman, because he played a very crucial role in the last 15 years against the violence of the last necropolitical regime, a regime built on the narrative of the war on terror. And he took personal risks. He was physically attacked, he was legally attacked. And I would request that the different tendencies back home, they create a room to have Brother Rahman back in the country, construction of a new society after the ousting of ouster. And we need that kind of Osama, I think your question was related to the question of Umma and how that lens could be useful in thinking about what's going on in Bangladesh. And I would like to begin by saying that there has to be a kind of understanding that is political in nature before we begin sort of moralistic discourse. And so, I want to mention that one of the main crises that we have is the question of Islam being unresolved within the history, the political genealogy of the question of Islam within the state formation of Bangladesh. So this past regime was not simply an autocratic regime. Our dear brother Mahmudur Rahman used the term fascism, and there are other terms. I use that it's a secular necropolitical regime, which I use from the theorist, Cameroonian theorist Achille Mbembe, who used the term necropolitics to think about a question of death dealing that happens in post-colonial conditions. The Sheikh Hasina regime, as Brother Rahman mentioned, have disappeared so many people. In 2000, my work is focused on looking at an archive of death of the Shapla massacre in 2013. And it was very difficult, even as a researcher, to stay away from intelligence agents and other state repressive mechanisms to do the work. And there are, of course, many people who have given their lives. And so the question of Islam is a very significant question. The narrative of war on terror, as Brother Rahman had mentioned, was central in the way the Hasina regime worked. And the country itself, the constitution itself, Hasina regime actually, its necropolitical system they've created a constitutional basis for it. So they've made various kinds of constitutional changes, and then they also included a change which did not allow now to change it back to anything. So it's a constitutionally based politics of death. It's a constitutionally based kind of fascism, if you want to use that term, to describe the regime. And in that structure, there is a return to the 72 constitution, which is basically a way to identify the enemies of the state to be the question of Islam in relation to politics. So we know that when the slogan of the students, or they use the word Razakar, that who are you, who am I, Razakar, Razakar, that term was a play against the prime minister's sort of derogatory use of the term to name student protesters as those who are against the state. And this kind of rhetorical use of terms like jongi, which means militant, terms like shontrashi, which means terrorist, terms like rajakar, which goes back to the history of the state in relation to history of the East Pakistan, West Pakistan debate, is a way in which Bengali nationalism established itself against the very idea of the Umma. And so this is very, very significant, the way the Awami League regime have worked itself out theoretically within its constitutional coordinates of the constitution itself. So this is a very important point. So in order for this political and social revolt to actually turn into a revolution, there needs to be a very serious reevaluation of this political genealogy of the question of Islam remaining unresolved. Now there are certain tendencies within Bangladesh who are using terms like post-Islamism, post-ideology. It's a way to kind of stay away from resolving this question. It's a way to actually sneak past the central question that triggered the entire set of protests we saw. Now, of course, the protests were done by many different tendencies in the country. There's no doubt about that. But it also includes many who come from Islamic oriented tendencies. We know even madrasa students were deeply involved. In 2013, Bangladeshi civil society also has been very seriously trained in the war on terror logic and mindset, that in 2013, when the massacres of madrasa students happened, right, the regime was able to kind of deny it at first and then tried to hide it, and the civil society and the mainstream politicians were unable to address it in a serious way, including many in the mainstream population who are not from the underclass. So it's very important that the erasure of Islam and Islamic subjectivity was fundamental to this kind of killing machine that Hasina had created. And so it goes beyond the state in certain ways. That's why the conversations that are happening in the civil society is really significant. One of the ways that this kind of post-Islamism term is now used within the context of Bangladesh, I don't want to go outside of the context, is that it wants to again ignore the question of Islam. right? It wants to ignore it in relation to the question of the state. And this is a very, very significant component. So what we're witnessing, and the concern for me as an observer who works in social science and the humanities, is that whether that it will not be successful if we transition from a kind of ontological secularism, meaning I ontologically, politically construct the enemy as anyone who has certain kinds of sentiments towards Pakistan, let's say that's positive, or certain kinds of understanding of our history that is different from the 71 narrative built through propaganda mechanisms and various kinds of cultural production. Now, if I do that, so that would be you would be considered the enemy, etc. Or if you have leanings towards certain kinds of Islamic parties, you would be considered the enemy, right? That's the Rajakar term and the usefulness of it from the Bengali nationalist narrative point. The concern is now everyone knows this. The students think it's a joke. They've shown with their courage that they refuse this kind of narrative. They refuse this kind of identification of the enemy of the state, et cetera, right? They've actually stood up, and this is phenomenal to see. And we also saw that students in Pakistan have also used the same words to explain, to show certain kinds of solidarity with the students in Bangladesh and the people of Bangladesh, which is really phenomenal and inspiring. But the worry I would have is to think about how this kind of secularity is moving from an ontological basis to a disciplinary basis. So now, in some ways, the way the post-Islamic discourse is coming up is to basically say, well, we'll include.
Unfortunately, I think Dr.
That's it.
Tanzin, your connection was disconnected, so you said you would include something. If you can continue from that point, you would include.
Can you hear me now?
Yes.
Okay, wonderful. So the concern is that there is a transition happening from an ontological basis, which is what the Hasina regime did, to a new kind of secularism, which would discipline Muslims into a kind of secular state building process in which the Islam question still will be unresolved. So this is another way. So and some of the when I saw certain kinds of rhetoric being used in relation to post-Islam, it wanted to identify any kind of mention of this problem as not the main question or the central question of the future of the state. And I think the idea is to bring in Islamists and then turn them into other kinds of heterodox variation of Islam. And so there's a mechanism, and I wrote this in one of my papers, a de-essentialization of Islam, and basically removing the centrality of the Quran and the Hadith and the structure that Islam basically views itself, self-represents with, and basically focusing on other versions of Islam and sort of saying that there are many Islams, these sorts of things. And we know these debates from Shahab Ahmed and others, and those kinds of conceptualizations are now being used to kind of include to control. So this is kind of a disciplinary mechanism of the subject. So the way this is done. So now, having said that, some good points that are really encouraging is, of course, that some of the people who are being freed from places like Ainaghar, like the black sites of torture and interrogation, and also the fact that the Islamic tendencies are very, very positive about what's happening in relation to the shift. Obviously, they're glad that Hasina is no more there. Like, I'm glad I can go back and actually do research potentially without having intelligence agents following me around and barely making it out of there and so on. So it's very important to look at that, how, for example, Jamaat-e-Islami have been extremely positive in the way that they've dealt with these questions, and they've came forward to be supportive of the current sort of shift in power. And that's very, very good sign. But then we've noticed that, for example, the other party, BNP, had worked with Jamaat in 2001 prior to the intervention from the outside. They had a very strong electoral victory, right? It was phenomenal against the Awami League. Now we're noticing significant difference emerging. And if you notice, of course, I know that the audience for us, a lot of non-Bengalis are probably not watching each and every news items that's coming out. But BNP, for example, gave remarks that are very critical of Jamaat-e-Islami. And that is a concern because now, and then Dr. Mahmudur Rahman just mentioned that Hasina may have left, but Indian interest is still interested in Bangladesh. Obviously, it's a major slap on their face to the intelligence and security apparatus, the hegemonic Indian influence on the country. But it doesn't mean that they're going to leave their interests. They're not going to just pack up and go. So there are a lot of raw agents, the Indian intelligence term, agents throughout our institutions that are infiltrated our institutions. As a result, there's continuously influencing political rhetoric of mainstream parties. So the idea that even in this moment that there is actual disagreement from BNP, and they're using the 71 narrative to denounce Jamaat. In a recent public statement, for example, Fokrul mentioned that we don't want to work with those who are against the 71, liberation, etc. That's the same exact rhetoric that Hasina used in the past. So if they have disagreements, the question would be, why are they using the rhetoric of Bengali nationalism and vulgar secularism against the Islamic tendencies? So these are some of the problems that I wanted to bring up, that the question of Islam, without resolving it for the state, because Bangladeshis carry the spirit of Islam, the state must reflect that. So if the state doesn't reflect that, if the constitution does not reflect that, right? If the new regime in its various rhetorical interactions, if they do not reflect that, then we have a new kind of set of concerns, right? Again, this is time for observation and time to take note of those kinds of things. And the way how the new state formation will take place, we don't know. How much of that will be influenced by these sorts of questioning, we don't know yet. We're observing, very positively observing, but also in some ways we have to be suspicious in the Nietzschean sense, the hermeneutics of suspicion. We have to kind of observe how the discourse is emerging, if that makes sense. Having said that, I would stop right there. So appreciate it.
Jazakumullah khairan, Tanzim Bhai. Really, I think, again, I'm going to thank you for keeping to time so impeccably, but also raising some very knotty and challenging, but also very real, I was going to say theoretical problems, but they're very real on the ground implications of theoretical challenges that we face. And I want to highlight, in a sense, you're saying the political question of Islam has been disregarded almost sort of systematically, but on the other hand, it's not been disregarded because Jamaat has been now sort of indirectly attacked by its former ally for who knows what reason. In interest of full disclosure, my grandfather was the Emir of Jamaat in Bangladesh for many years, as is known by all my colleagues on the panel. But this globalization of a secular hegemony has meant that in order to appeal to all sorts of parties on an international scale, perhaps, including potentially India, or at least trying to neutralize India's hostility towards it, is BNP, engaged in some problematic posturing. But that normalizes and deepens these hegemonic, sort of secularizing ontologies. So this is something, inshallah, we can look at. You also mentioned the problematic of post-Islamism, which, of course, our next speaker, coming from An-Nahda, will have a particular insight to, perhaps a different insight to previous speakers. So I'd like to maybe take this as an opportunity to welcome Dr. Rafiq Abdus Salam. Really an honor to have you on the panel. Dr. Rafiq is a Tunisian politician and an executive committee member of An-Nahda party. And he comes to us, of course, from a country that experienced, or we should give credit where credit is due, started the Arab Spring of, in the case of An-Nahda, late 2010 to early 2011. And, of course, has seen significant challenges since then and currently is living in a, quasi-authoritarian state. And so I can just briefly give a bit of background and then I will give you the floor, inshallah, Dr. Abdus Salam. So he served, Dr. Rafiq Abdul Salam served as the Minister of Foreign Affairs between 2011 and 2013, representing Tunisia's first democratically elected government under Prime Minister Hamadi Jibali. Dr. Abdul Salam played a prominent role in founding the Tunisian Student General Union in the 1980s. And he is the founder and director of the London-based Centre for Strategic and Diplomatic Studies, CSDS, and the founder of the Maghrib Centre for Research and Translations, and the former chair of the London Platform for Dialogue. And he worked as a senior researcher and the head of research and studies at the Al Jazeera Centre for Studies. He holds a PhD in politics and international relations from the University of Westminster and is the author of several books. So it really gives me great honour to invite once again, similar in a sense to Dr. Mahmudur Rahman, someone who is both a scholar but also has very direct political experience. So with that, I welcome you to the floor, and you have the floor for the next 15 minutes, inshallah.
Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim. Wassalatu wassalamu ala ashraf al-mursaleen. Thank you, Dr. Wissama. Thank you for our brothers and colleagues in Ummatics for having me for this conference. And I think it's very important to speak about and to assess the Bangladeshi revolution. And I will follow the line of comparison that has been made by Brother Dr. Mahmoud between the Bangladeshi revolution and what is known as the Arab Spring. And I follow this line of analysis. I think the Bangladeshi revolution, led by student movement after 16 years of rule by Sheikh Hasina and her ruling Awami League Party, is inspiring not only to Bangladeshi or to the Bangladesh, but to people around the Muslim world. It represents a model of peaceful change driven by an educated vanguard that overthrow Sheikh Hasina autocratic family rule. The unexpected revolution, bred by an accumulation of grievances and anger across Bangladeshi society, furthered by the execution of a number of influential political figures, leaders, and civil society activists. What fueled this movement was the inequalities in the realm of job recruitments, inequalities facilitated by Sheikh Hasina granted positions predominantly to members of the ruling Awami League Party at the expense of the rest of the citizens. I think although the nation state is a solid fact in the Islamic world and has imposed itself since the First World War, it is well known, for historical and political reasons. But I think the idea of the Umma that transcends the borders of the nation states and is spiritually and culturally unified is still present in the consciousness of the Muslim world, from Morocco to Indonesia. What is happening in Bangladesh is not separate from what happened in the Arab world in what is known as the Arab Spring, what is known as the Arab Spring revolutions in Tunisia, Egypt, Libya, Yemen, Syria, and other countries. Because this large area called the Islamic world is influenced by each other politically and culturally, and its peoples monitor what is happening in any of these countries. Therefore, I would like to speak there from my personal experience about lessons learned from the experience of the Arab Spring that can be used in the Bangladeshi revolution. I think I see some similarities in certain perspectives and in many features between what is known as the Arab Spring that started from Tunisia and expanded to other Arabic countries compared to the Bangladeshi revolution. And I think there are some lessons that needed to be learned from the Arab Spring revolutions. Of course, there is no final and absolute model for revolutions. And although the narrative of the French Revolution has remained dominating in global political thought, it still is one experience among many. Each country has its own characteristics and experiences that cannot be generalized but can be benefited from. There is no unified and single model for revolutions. Each country has its own model and its own experience. What has happened and is happening in Bangladesh so far is an uprising similar to the Arab Spring revolutions at the beginning, which could turn into a revolution if it stays on track. And it could also turn into a mere uprising that can be derailed and thrown completely off track, as happened with the Arab Spring. Therefore, stopping the revolution at the beginning or stopping the revolution at the beginning of the road or in the middle of the road could turn into an aborted and betrayed revolution. So you have to be aware here, stopping the process of revolution in the beginning or in the middle of the road could, aborted and betrayed, could be, transform the revolution in a aborted and betrayed revolution. History informs us on the excesses and violence of revolutions, from the Jacobin model of the French Revolution to the Bolsheviks of Russia. And this requires us to be mindful of the zeal and populism that characterizes some revolutions. But on the other hand, it tells us about the dozens of suppressed revolutions lost due to their lack of determination and indecisiveness that enabled the forces of the old regime to resurrect themselves and move to contain, change, then abort it altogether. So we have to be aware the Bangladeshi revolution is similar in some aspect of the Tunisian and Egyptian revolutions, as it was led by youth groups and dedicated field activists, but there are no organized parties behind it, and it does not have a real political program other than some certain demands and slogans. Though, in my opinion, the leadership is present and intelligent, and the program does not necessarily have to be formed in the beginning, but it can be formed in the heart of the revolutionary movement. And that may be called the praxis if I use the Marxist terminology. The most important points that revolutionary forces must pay attention to are the necessity of dismantling the old regime and its old structures, headed by the judiciary and the security apparatus, and then working to neutralize the army and to keep it away from politics, and preventing the symbols and leaders of the old regime from engaging in any political activity. Stopping the revolutionary movement before dismantling the old regime carries the risk of circumventing the young revolution and suppressing it later. Experiences has shown that counter-revolutions lurk and change colors in the new phases, and when they find an opportunity to reposition themselves, they grow more ferocious and violent, as we saw in Egypt and in some extent in Tunisia. The idea of reconciliation with the old regime is not bad in itself, but it should not be sought at the beginning, but rather after shaking the foundations of the old regime to the core and radically serving its relationship with the state due to the overlap between the ruling system and the state due to the influence of the authoritarian legacy. Reconciliation with an old regime, while it is still strong with the legacy of experience in control and domination of the state apparatus, could be dangerous to the experiment, to the revolution, or to the experiment as a whole. I think the most dangerous thing facing revolution is their direct transformation into electoral revolutions in which candidates compete before deciding the battle within the old regime and before deciding the major options and policy. So it is very dangerous to transform a political revolution to an electoral revolution before dismantling, the pillars and the foundations of the old regime. And this is the case. This is exactly what happened in Tunisia as well in Egypt, but more clearly in Egypt. In transitory period in Tunisia, we have faced to have, certain degree of consensus between different, political forces, different political players. But in the case of Egypt, within few months, it transformed from a political revolution to an electoral revolution. And the risk is definitely, within an electoral revolution, the political parties and the political players will enter in the phase of conflict and polarization. And this is very dangerous in the process of the revolution because, pushing the revolution to the stage of polarization and division before, setting up the foundations of the old regime, the foundation of the new regime, and dismantling the pillars and the foundations of the old regime could be very risky for the whole political process, because elections necessarily mean competition and political division between elites and parties, while dismantling the old system requires unity in vision and policies, and then competitions take place after that. This is the normal way to preserve the line of the revolution and to minimize the risk. And I think the most dangerous thing facing revolutions in the Islamic world is ethnic, religious, and sectarian division, especially in the relatively diverse societies in countries like Bangladesh. Therefore, it is important to work on national unity and reject turning the political conflict into a religious, sectarian, or tribal conflict, as we saw in Syria, Yemen, and Libya in the Arab world. Sorry. And I think political and ideological polarization as well, under the title of the conflict between Islamists and secularists, is harmful to the revolution and political stability, as it enables many forces to unite under the title of confronting Islamic terrorism or the danger of political Islam, and they often find external support for the task. And therefore, the conflict must be between the camp of Democrats in the face of tyrants with their different political and intellectual orientations, and not between Islamists and secularists. And I think just as the old regime and the forces of the counter-revolution have their supporters and regional and international alliances, the forces of change need to form regional and international alliances to protect the experiment and prevent its collapse. The most dangerous thing that the Egyptian revolution faced, and then the rest of the Arab revolutions, was that they found themselves without external support and facing a regional and international axis hostile to revolutions and democracy and supportive of counter-revolution. Therefore, it is very possible that the revolution in Bangladesh will face the same dilemma today, with the presence of a major powerful hostile to it led by India. The revolution does not necessarily need an ideological revolutionary program, as Lenin, for example, talks about, but it needs a clear vision and work program that sets the priorities of the next stage. This is what can be called the minimum program around which most political forces agree. There is no necessity to have a determined political program in the beginning, since the initiative, but the revolution needs, a set of priorities and a minimum program that determine, the main goals and the main priorities for the political movement. I think the stage of revolutionary or democratic transition often brings a state of confusion and chaos with weak institutions, and this may lead to the reaction among a populace more interested in stability and order more than freedom. Therefore, it is very important to maintain a kind of balance between freedom and order, and between democracy and the rule of law, so that things do not rush into a state of chaos that leads to people's aversion of the revolution and their longing for the stability of the dictatorial regime. This is the dichotomy between the demands and the priority of the people, the laymen in the street, and the elite. The elite wants more freedom, but the population are more interested in economic situation. As well, the division or the dichotomy between the priority of stability and priority of freedom. And this division could push the people to be more attached to the previous regime or to the old regime. So in the stage of revolutions, there is often a conflict, as I said before, between the priorities of the elite and the priorities of the people. The elite wants more freedom and democracy, while the populace wants development and improvement of living conditions first and foremost. Therefore, it is essential to pay special attention to the economic and development alongside political reform and dismantling of the old regime. And I think if my time is finished, I have to stop here. How many minutes do I have?
Unfortunately,
do I have more time?
This is around maybe a minute.
So
if that's okay.
Okay, a minute. I'll go to the conclusion. I think there is a price that revolutions must pay in terms of security and economic difficulties and social shocks that are ultimately inevitable, while working to reduce this cost as much as possible. But the alternative of that is the collapse of the revolution and the failure of the change project. If counter-revolutions are able to return, they will be more violent, ferocious, and vengeful towards the youth than ever before. And therefore, Bangladeshi youth have no choice but to work to make the revolution a success by arming themselves with willpower and vigilance. And thank you very much. I have to stop here. Thank you.
جزاكم الله خيرا. بارك الله فيكم Dr. Rafiq, and thank you to all three guests for giving us opening remarks that have challenged us to think about this the question of the Bangladeshi revolution of the last month. And we now have roughly an hour in which to take questions from our audience, but also to engage in discussion. I think there's going to be a lot of inevitably organic conversation going on based on what the three of you have mentioned. I wanted to actually take this opportunity to highlight three concepts which have either been stated very explicitly or in some sense are the elephant in the room that we need to grapple with. And those three concepts are revolution, democracy, and the nation state. So with respect to the first concept, I just want to highlight, and I think the scholars will all recognize that the definition of a revolution requires very often very fundamental change to take place. And I think in Bangladesh we are arguably in a process, but there remains a lot of the old elements of the ancien regime, in place, and certain figureheads have changed. So is it fair to call this a revolution, or is this an aspirational label that you're giving it at this stage? So, when you speak of this revolution, I'd like to better understand that. And this, of course, the session is called Bangladesh's Revolution, so this can be also attributed as a question to ourselves at Ummatics. So, I guess, how do we think about the current state of play in revolutionary terms? On the question of democracy, this is an old chestnut, as it were, the question of democracy in Islam. And the reason I raise this, and of course, Annahda has a very specific experience with this, but in Bangladesh, when we think about democracy, the West generally is talking about liberal democracy or a certain type of Western democracy. And if it's not that, it's not democracy in their view. But Muslim scholars have talked about an Islamic democracy. I think it's quite under-theorized still, but one of the ways in which I think about this is, liberalism or liberal democracy basically says, you can have democracy, but the red lines are liberalism. And in Islamic democracy, you can have democracy, but the red lines are set, by Islamic values. So, each of them will have their implications. But I think when we talk about democracy in general, how do we avoid the pitfalls of being taken into global institutional forces that are going to try and bring about a certain form that might not exactly fit with our Islamic values, or in some cases may present profound challenges to them. And then finally, with the question of the nation state, this is a more general reflection. At this stage of the Ummah's development, the nation state is a hegemonic concept, and the Ummah as a concept is more or less a myth. It doesn't really exist in reality as a force in the political realm. And in a sense, that's one of the reasons why the Ummah can be, as the famous hadith states, people can eat from it as they're having a meal. Other nations can come and eat from us. And I think there is a way of thinking about this by saying, well, we shouldn't sort of try and highlight the tensions between secularism and Islamists, because this is a way of targeting us, and it certainly has been used as a tool to victimize Muslims and separate them out, otherize them, and then in the context of the war on terror, securitize them and attack them with impunity. But at the same time, this is a very fundamental question about how Muslims are to engage in self-preservation as a community, as an ummah. And so we see this, of course, most saliently right now in Gaza, which is a liberal genocide taking place before our very eyes, with the full support of global liberal establishments. And so, there are severe limits to the acquiescing to liberal secular norms, which I think we need to be very alive to, but at the same time recognize, well, we're not going to get rid of the nation state tomorrow, not by any stretch of the imagination. So how do we negotiate the reality of the nation state in a place like Bangladesh, which is a 91% Muslim country, which is such mashallah, I feel that there's a very deep religious impulse in Bangladesh. It goes back centuries, obviously. How do we use that to navigate this sort of very testing and delicate time? And I want to perhaps give, if I may, I want to give the floor to Dr. Mahmudur Rahman, because this is a question that you've been thinking about for decades as well. And to start, and then I would welcome the other scholars.
Thank you. Thank you, Dr. Osama, and thank you, Brother Rafiq. Before I answer to your question, I want to set a few fundamentals about Bangladesh, because that is necessary, especially for Dr. Rafiq to understand the Bangladeshi environment. Because we know about Bangladesh, and that's why in my preliminary intervention, I avoided the domestic issues, which Dr. Rafiq may not be aware. So the fundamentals as I see in Bangladesh from my experience and from my study, first of all is let us talk about what happened. We are talking about revolution, and Brother Rafiq talked about uprising. I have a very simple definition of the difference between uprising and revolution. Very simple, not very theoretical. It's my very easy and understandable difference. In the case of uprising, it is only targeted to changing the ruler, only the ruler or the government, whoever in his power, and the uprising is against it. And in case of revolution, when you talk about revolution, it is the changing of the system. So that is my very simple definition and the difference between the two. So in this case, in case of Bangladesh, what has happened? We have achieved the first. So uprising, it is a successful uprising because the fascist ruler is not there. But when you talk about revolution, the changing the system, there lies the problem. Will it now graduate to become a revolution? The uprising, will it become a revolution now? I hope it becomes a revolution. But again, the fundamental is, in this uprising, if we call it uprising for a moment, there was no political philosophy behind it, other than really fighting against a fascist regime. So what was the political philosophy? It was not there. And if we look into the composition of the interim government, what is the political philosophy of this interim government? We don't know. And they haven't made it clear that what is their situation. Because in the case of, again, fundamentals, in the case of Bangladesh, Dr. Rafiq should know it. Actually, in Bangladesh, this is my view, you may disagree and you may debate on that. In Bangladesh, I understand there is no secularist philosophy. It is all Islamophobic political narrative. The people who talk about that we are secular, they are not secular. They are basically Islamophobic. So that is the fundamental situation in Bangladesh. You have to understand that first, and you have to accept that situation. And what is the basis of this secular political discourse? It is, the brother Tasneem has said, it is the Bengali nationalism. Now, again, for Dr. Rafiq to understand, what is this Bengali nationalism? the root, the fountainhead of Bengali nationalism is the 18th century Bengali Renaissance. And the 18th century Bengali Renaissance was British aided, by the colonial power aided, for the upliftment of the Hindu people, Hindu Bengalis. It was not for the upliftment of the Muslim population in those days. And in that narrative of Bengali Renaissance, you will not find the Muslims. Muslims was outside. They were treated as Dr. Osama has said, the otherization. They were treated as others. If you read the book of Niraj Chaudhary, the autobiography of an unknown Indian, in that book, Niraj Chaudhary has written a lot about the Bengali Renaissance, because he is from 19th century, but he was a very young man in the end of 18th century. He was a very young boy studying in the school. So he talks a lot about the Bengali Renaissance of those days. Now the Bangladesh, the political discourse, especially the Awami League and the so-called secularist, the political people, they have this Bengali nationalism narrative starting from the 18th century Bengali Renaissance, which is basically a Bengali Hindu Renaissance. Muslims are totally outside of the domain in that. So that is the fundamental situation. Now, to fight against this situation, we have to have our own narrative. I mean, I'm now suggesting, very interesting. I'm suggesting that why not we start because, as you said, that nation state is a reality. We cannot talk against nation state. When you talk about Umma, I mean, my question is, where is the Umma? What is happening today in Gaza? Where is the Umma? I don't find any Umma in Gaza. Umma is dead in Gaza. I wrote an editorial in my newspaper. I said OIC and Arab League are buried in Gaza. That was the title of my editorial. That those two organizations are completely buried in Gaza today, along with the young boys and children of our Palestinian brothers and sisters. So the point I'm trying to make, why not we create a narrative of Bengali Muslim narrative for the Bangladeshi people to fight against the so-called Bengali narrative. And because Bengali narrative is basically, as I am repeating myself probably, it is Bengali Hindu Renaissance narrative. So we need to create a new narrative for the Bengali Muslim narrative for the people of Bangladesh to remain independent from the Indian hegemony. Because in this movement, what is happening? It's happening, this is very interesting. The people, they actually revolted against the fascist regime, but at the same time, they have a great anger now. The majority of the people of Bangladesh they have a great anger against India. They now understand what is the true face of Indian hegemony, which we were talking about. I was talking about Indian hegemony for the last 20 years. Now, initially at the beginning part of my articles and political discourse, I found so many people protesting against my position because they were telling me that I am probably too radical. I mean, they wanted to tell me that maybe I'm a terrorist. They cannot tell it, but they used to tell me I'm a radical. This is the second category of terrorism. And when you graduate from radical, you become a terrorist. So I never became a terrorist, but I was considered radical. When I was talking about Indian hegemony, I was talking about the Bengali Muslim narrative and Bengali Muslim nationalism. So this is very important. Now the people, even the young people of the college and universities, they see the ugly face of Indian hegemony. So that is a development. Definitely that is a development that has happened during the last 2 decades. People now see India as one of our main threat for our sovereignty and for our freedom. The main threat is India. It is now more or less accepted by majority of the people of Bangladesh. But to become successful in this revolution, we need to create a new narrative. We have to fight against the so-called Bengali narrative of Awami League and other secular political parties. Now the problem is that Islamic parties in Bangladesh are not in a position yet to go to power. So they have to be very
Dr.
patient
Mahmoud,
about it. I agree with
if I can
Dr.
ask just to be a bit more concise, if that's okay, because if I can just ask if you can sort of be a bit more concise so that the other panelists can respond to you as well. But please,
so
go
let me
ahead.
just finish it with this.
Yes.
So the point I'm trying, and the last point I want to make before I finish, you are talking about democracy. I have an understanding that actually the Western countries, they don't want democracy in the Islamic countries. They want autocrats in Islamic countries, because if there is really true democracy, even if it is a liberal democracy, I'm not really contesting what is Islamic democracy and what is liberal democracy. Even if what we mean by liberal democracy, if we have democracy in most of the Muslim countries, we'll see that pro-Islamic people will rule those countries. And because of that fact, the Western countries, including America, they preach about democracy, but they actually don't want democracy in Islamic countries. A proof of that is Egypt of today. Thank you.
And not just Egypt, of course. A proof of that going back to 2006 is Gaza, and the fact that Hamas actually won the elections, democratically, and that was rejected. And this is what, to a certain extent, has led to the present genocide. That was actually overseen by Jimmy Carter, and he's someone who signed off on the soundness of that election. So I think this is the challenge with liberalism, that unless it comes to liberal consequences which are also useful to neoliberal capitalism, it's going to struggle to be able to live with its actual values and end up letting other values that are also part of the overall package trump those considerations. Jazakumullah khair, Dr. Mahmoud, and apologies to cut you off like this. Because we have limited time, I did want to give everyone the opportunity. And Dr. Rafiq, I feel like some of this, was actually a comment about the utility, shall we say, of drawing on secular models of pluralism in a democratic setting, and without necessarily recognizing that there are some very fundamental points of opposition or a context such as the global war on terror and the securitization of Muslims. And I wonder if you have any particular comment on that, since it was directed, I think, partly at you, if I've understood correctly, Dr. Mahmoud.
Thank you, Dr. Osama. I fully agree with brother Dr. Mahmoud about the distinction that he had made between uprising and revolution. Definitely, the uprising means, to target the head of the state or the head of the regime, while revolution means the dismantlement of the old regime and the creation of new political legitimacy, new political system. But I think I want to show that revolution is a process, and sometimes it is a long and complicated process. It is not just a point that we reach revolution within a few days. Definitely, there are different modes, different experiences of revolution. If you look at the dominant model, which is the French Revolution, the revolution took at least 1 century to set its to finalize its process, while in the Bolshevik, for example, it takes a few years. So it depends on the political context, and that's why they challenge now how to transform the uprising that happened in Bangladesh as well, the uprisings before that in the what is known as the Arab Spring, to be transformed on a revolution. And any revolution is taking different waves of progress and regress. And this is what happened, for example, in the experience of Tunisia. We have different waves of revolution and counter-revolution, and we're still living under this dilemma and dynamism. The second point, I fully agree also, to produce a counter-narrative. If nationalism in Bangladesh is deeply interconnected with the Hindu, Indian tradition, why not producing a counter narrative? And I think this is the case, for example, in Pakistan. They don't know better than me. I'm not an expert. Nationalism in Pakistan is deeply interconnected, intertwined with Islam. So you can't separate Islam from nationalism in Pakistan and even in the Indian subcontinent as a whole. Why not having, a counter narrative which is based on mixture between Islam and nationalism? Since nationalism is a solid fact, you can't overtake it. But as well, Islam is a solid fact in the Muslim world, and this is the challenge or the difficulty: how to reconcile, or to create a new mode of narrative or counter narrative to the dominant narrative, which is based on nationalism and Hinduism. And I have to stop here.
Jazakumullah khairan. I think you raise an interesting sort of challenge in a sense for people who are thinking of Islam as the kind of most fundamental concept when we think about political questions. By raising the question of nationalism, and I'm drawn to the example of Turkey, where in some respects, and I don't know if this is I'm not a Turkey expert, but the success of Erdogan in the last several elections has been a function of, to quote Nick Danforth, he wrote a fascinating op-ed piece in a New Lines magazine shortly after Erdogan's presidential win, and he basically describes Erdogan as the success of a merging of Islam and nationalism. But as a consequence, you have two competing traditions of thought, and very often, mutually antagonistic in some sense. He's managed to balance that, but it works in Turkey. But Erdogan is one of the most powerful political leaders in the Muslim world, and he is oversees a country that is a NATO member, and yet what he has done for Gaza is very little beyond comments in the public realm. And this is another stark illustration, I think, of the severe limitations of nationalism, or the severe sort of limiting effect that nationalism has on ummatic action. I'm going to pass the floor to Dr. Tanzeen, but before I do so, if it's okay, Tanzeen Bhai, I'm going to mix it in with one of the questions which has come directed at you, which is the tension of the modern state and Islamic intervention is becoming very relevant, as you said. What productive avenues can young students take to approach this? So please feel free to merge that with the question that the previous sort of discussion. Jazakumullah khairan.
Wa yakum. Thank you for that. Thanks to Brother Mehdi Haq for that question. I can also see it on the side. I guess it's relevant to you bringing up the three terms that you use: revolution, democracy, and nation state. And I agree.
Sorry, we seem to have lost your connection. I don't know if anyone else can.
That the connection is lost.
Sorry,
Connection is lost.
Right? Okay, so you're back. You were about to mention Dr. Mahmudur Rahman, and then you got.
Can you?
cut off.
Oh, I just mentioned that Dr. Mahmudur Rahman had mentioned that revolution, the definition should be that there has to be a system change, and I agree with that. There's another component which I want to add to that, which is the idea of a political and ethical spirit of the people has to be reflected by the state. If it's not reflected, then that state does not represent the desire people will have. When you think about various theories of state, one of the theories of the state is that when people are with their families, the spirit is at the level of feeling and sentiment. When it's in civil society, it's at the level of instrumental, interpersonal, individual relations. But when it comes to the state, that's where, meaning the larger community, there is the possibility of the expression of the spirit of the people. So the fact is the current regime, not the current, the recent regime of Hasina, dominated the spirit of the people. And Dr. Mahmudur Rahman is very correct that the history of Bengali nationalism has a deep connection to a Brahmin tradition of the upper caste Hindu tradition. And therefore, as a counter to that, right, there's an Islamic spirit that cannot be ignored. And that's the whole point. So in the state, then we don't have a revolution. So in order for that to happen, there needs to be shredding of the constitution that we have. And there needs to be a moment of national reconciliation, new construction. And that already once happened in 75. So it's very important that we understand what national reconciliation means. I mean, of course, we'd have to be very, very careful of the Awami League and Indian agents in Bangladesh. But other than that, the other tendencies, the ones that carried this struggle together, there has to be a proper reconciliation process in order to arrive at the ground zero of politics. And that cannot happen without that process, and would have to observe and see whether we transition in that space. So the question of secularism is not my imagination. The question of the conflict and antagonism between the Islamophobic secular narrative and institutional structures in Bangladesh with the question of Islam is inherent to the very construction of Bangladesh. The idea that a nation kind of slipped out of the concept of Pakistan. From its foundation, it was kind of developed as an anti-Pakistani state. And that is something we have to reevaluate and rethink. This moment, in 2024, constantly the civil society says, oh, this is our 71 again. This might also be our stood up to Indian nation and said, we want to create society, our own state. So this is very, very important that this moment has the spirit of Shapla, which was the madrasa, the ulama came out 1 million strong and protested out of prophetic love that you cannot disrespect in our state, our and violently repressed, right? And so that massacre is a very important point. Without those moments, without those earlier forms of struggle, which carried the spirit of Islam, Bangladesh cannot resolve its crisis. It'll always be a remaining problem for us. So we have to reorient ourselves in how we think about our own history. That's number one. The question that this brother, and I'm gonna actually finish it quickly. The question that this brother asked me about how can people think about these for this.
Sorry, your sound, if you can rephrase the question, but I can read it out to you actually. So he said,
I lost the screen.
yeah, the tension of the modern state and Islamic intervention is becoming very relevant, as you said. What are productive avenues that young students can take to approach this? So that's actually alongside that part. I'll link to the 1971 comment that you made, and this perhaps can be a wider question for the rest of the panel. Someone asks, shouldn't the Islamic movement in Bangladesh be working towards a truth and reconciliation process like South Africa in 1994 or in Rwanda to break with the existing narrative about the 1971 war? So I think that was also kind of something that...
Yeah, I'm sorry about that interruption. There was something happened on my computer. No, so I think the idea would be to think about the relationship between the question of the state and how there has to be a Islam-friendly state through the national reconciliation process in which the spirit is carried. And that's the place where there has to be an actual intervention with a genuine interest in resolving the situation. And that's really relevant.
Unfortunately, Tanzin Bhai, your internet connection seems extremely weak, so I'm going to have to
you hear me
move
now?
on to some of the other scholars. I can hear you slightly. Yes. Do you want to add anything before we before I ask the others?
I mean, I just want to make sure that you could hear my response to the question.
I couldn't really, not clearly. So I don't know if you want to concisely, since your sound is clearer now, say it in just a minute or so, if that's all right.
I just want to say that there has to be constructing a state that allows. I don't know
Right. So
if you could.
yes, that much, I mean, has more or less been conveyed. The idea that, in a sense, 1971 is it's a taboo subject to talk about in this way. This is one of the fundamental problems. But 1971, as well as reflecting a question of independence for Bangladesh, it also reflects a question of secession from an Islamic entity that was aspired to. And even if that Islamic entity doesn't reflect the Ummah as a whole, in a sense, it reflected the Ummah in South Asia. And so this, in a sense, has been, or that event has been weaponized by Awami League, and Awami League being kind of the default secularist actor, and also sort of close to the Indians through Sheikh Mujib and now Hasina. It's been weaponized to delegitimize Islam in Bangladesh to a certain extent as well. And the relegitimation of Islam in Bangladesh, does that entail a real grappling with what happened in 1971? This is something which I feel less than qualified to comment on, but perhaps I can, if I may, direct this at Dr. Mahmudur Rahman, but Dr. Mahmud, you may also wish to address other aspects of the discussion that have gone so far. And we do have other questions from the audience, but we will, inshallah, look to those in the coming minutes. We, alhamdulillah, have still got 34 minutes to speak.
Thank you, Dr. Osama. We have discussed about, especially Dr. Tanzeen has talked about Shapla a couple of times. I want to raise this Shapla issue a little bit because to understand the situation of Bangladesh. You see, Brother Tazlin has said that the government tried to hide Shapla massacre. I will say that they didn't try to hide Shapla. In fact, they went beyond that. They tried to justify Shapla massacre, which is much more dangerous than the hiding. Because when you hide something, you have a...
Dr. Mahmoud, if I can briefly interrupt you and ask you, since we don't have necessarily exclusively Bangladeshis watching this, but members from the Ummah at large, perhaps you can give a very brief background on what the Shapla massacre was of 2013.
Okay. The Shapla massacre was actually, it was again an uprising, if I use the term uprising of the Islamic students of the madrasa and the Islamic schools against the insult of our Prophet, because the insult of our Prophet was going on in the media for a long time, and in the so-called secular media. So ultimately, in 2013, the students and of the madrasa, the Islamic schools, and the alims, they united, and they actually they created an uprising of more than 1 million people marching towards Dhaka, and they were demanding that those who are insulting our Prophet ﷺ should be punished. I mean, that was the basically premise, and they had 13-point agenda. But I'm not talking about those agendas of the madrasa people. Basically, this was the premise, and they demanded from the government, and the people more or less supported them. But there was a difference. I was coming to that point. I will come to that. But what the government did, they used all sorts of coercive power of the state. It was a brutal crackdown on the madrasa students and the alims, and they massacred. Some say it is more than 1,000. I would say it is hundreds of people were massacred in one day, similar to what has happened during the August Revolution. Actually, the government, they use the same tactics of using the coercive power of the state. But in case of Shapla, what has happened? The government was successful because they used the Islamic terror card. And if you remember, in 2013, the Islamic terror card was relevant at that point of time. It is not relevant that much today, but at that time it was relevant. So what happened? The Western world, they actually supported the government. They supported the massacre of the Islamists because they thought it was an uprising of the Islamist people to take state power. So naturally, America and the Western countries were against it. India was, of course, against it. And there was also a class issue, let me tell you. because most of the madrasa students, they come from the poorer background, from the rural background. So the city, urban people, they did not support that movement the way they supported this time. And because of that, according to my understanding, because of that, this time the uprising was successful. And in 2013, it was not successful because the so-called middle class and the upper middle class, they did not support the movement of the madrasa people. They thought that we are the urban people, these young kids or young people coming from the poorer section of the society, coming from the rural areas. I mean, they understand nothing. They will take the country, back like so-called Talibanization of the country. So that was the point they were talking about. But this time, the government used the same tactic, but failed, because this time it was the students of the so-called secular institutions. They were at the forefront of the movement. They were the vanguard of this movement. So that's why it was easier for the urban population, for the middle class people, to support this movement and come out to street in millions with the women's, the elderly people, even the children. They came down to street to support this movement. So when we talk about the issue of Islam in Bangladesh, I would rather suggest not to start our discourse from 1971, not even to start our discourse from 1947. We need to start our discourse from the independent Sultan era of Bengal, because the independent sultans of Bangladesh in 13th century, they actually created the political entity called Bengal. Before the independent sultanate, there was no Bengal. I mean, geographically it was there, but as a political entity, it was not there. Before, it was the Hindu kings and the Buddhist rulers, before the Muslims took over Bengal. They used to call it Gaur, G-A-U-D, Gaur. So Gaur was the name of the places, and Bengal was not united under one political umbrella at that time. Bengal was divided. Various names of Bengal. Gaur was one name. Lakhnauti was another name. There are 8 or 9 parts of Bengal. It was Samsuddin Ilyas Shah, the independent Sultan of Bengal, who first united Bengal under one political entity, and he gave himself the title Sultan of Bangala, meaning Sultan of Bengal. So actually, this political identity of Bengal started with the Muslims. So if we really, I think it is, it can be a very, very difficult work, very big work, but we need to work on it. If we want to create a new narrative, challenging the so-called 18th century Hindu Renaissance narrative, then we have to start our narrative from the independent Sultanate of 13th century. Thank you.
Jazakumullah khairan. I think the point of narrative building is something which we can't disregard the significance of. So as I think a number of the panelists have mentioned, the demonization, for example, of Razakars in the course of the Awami League regime and the setting up of the so-called International Crimes Tribunal, which was used to liquidate official enemies, meaning the opposition parties, but also had a very significant role in helping the narrative of India helped us become liberated from the Pakistanis who were persecuting us, etc. Even if there may have been elements of truth in certain behaviors on the part of our Pakistani brothers. That narrative has been very successful. It's something which manifests in culture. It's something that manifests in intellectual discourse. And one thinks of the sort of intellectuals that one finds in sort of the universities in Bangladesh who write about these sorts of areas. I wonder what you think the prospects are of such a discourse actually taking hold. And I suppose this is for sort of the Bangladeshi members of the panel. But I want to also ask Dr. Rafiq this question in the sense that there is a demonization, or shaitana, as they say in Arabic, of Islamic oriented parties. So even though An-Nahda took this path of describing themselves as Muslim Democrats and relinquishing the title of Islamiyin in Arabic. Yet they were still demonized by the the elements that were being backed very often by the liberal autocrats or liberal dictators of the region, like Mohammed bin Zayed, or their sort of proxies in places like Libya. And so I wonder to what extent you think as well that narrative discourse has played an important role in the demonization of certain Muslims through otherization. But to what extent is it possible for us to genuinely work against that? What do you see as the process of that coming about? This is a question for everyone, and this kind of harks back to the question asked earlier, that what can young people do? What are productive avenues for young people to do to approach these sorts of tensions in contemporary discourse, the marginalization of Islam? I'm happy for yes, Dr. Rafiq, please. Sure.
Yeah, thank you, Dr. Osam. It's a very important question. I think this is go back to the issue, the problematic of democracy in the Muslim world. I think, generally speaking, democracy is accepted, and it is well-founded in the Islamic discourse for a long time, since the Reformation movement in the 19th century with Al-Afghani, Abdu, Rashid Rida, and in the Muslim Indian subcontinent since early times. And in the modern times, the works of Yusuf al-Qardawi, Rashid al-Ghannouchi, and many others in the Muslim world, Khatami, even in Iran. Different school of thoughts, but within the Islamic framework, try to legitimize democracy within an Islamic references. And I think democracy, as at the end of the day, is not a religion, and it is not an ideology. It is a check and balance powers. It's what is more important. Democracy is its tools and mechanisms more than its foundations or philosophy. Thus, this is raised the question: is in now secular, non-liberal democracy possible in the Muslim world? I say yes, it is possible. Liberal democracy is only possibility amongst many others. This is the first point. The second point, I think, what you have called demonization or shaitan of what is called political Islam or Islamist, I think is related to geopolitics of the region more than political ideas in itself. The theocratic regimes in the region, as well great powers, regional and international players, try to play this card to deepen the level of polarization in the Muslim world in the name of division between what is called Islamist and non-Islamist, or secular and Islamist, which is not true. The main division is, politically speaking, not religiously or ideologically speaking, is between the process of democratization and the process of authoritarianism, between the Democrats and non-Democrats. That is why it is in the interest of Islamists as well, the forces of democracy in the region, to be united and to face the camp of authoritarianism, as well the interventionist, the games and the strategies and the agenda of the international powers. As Dr. Mahmoud said before, even the Muslims accepted liberal democracy in its, in all its details. I think it will be precluded in the Muslim world, because this is related to the geopolitics and the interests of the international players. And this is what makes democracy a very complicated process in the Muslim world, due to the clash between the interests and the priorities of the masses of the people in the region, in the Muslim world. For them, democracy is a tool of liberation, and the international agenda for the international powers, international players, democracy is a tool for intervention and liberalization of the Muslim world, and to impose a certain elite, an isolated elite, far beyond the demands and the priorities of the masses. For the young people, I think their role is to deepen or to minimize the level of polarization, in the name of the division between Islamists and non-Islamists, and to deepen the level of unity, national unity, and to work with others in the process of democratization and moderate Islamization. Thank you.
Jazakumullah khairan. I think, Dr. Tanzeen, I was going to sort of bring you in at this point, but I don't know if Dr. Mahmoud, should I give the floor to Dr. Tanzeen first and then come to you, or would you like to address?
Go ahead, Doctor. I want to hear from Dr. Tanzeen.
So, Tanzeen Bhai, I also want to fold in another question from the audience for you, but please feel free to sort of riff off what you've heard already. So, one of the audience members asks, the tension of the modern... we've already addressed that. So let me tie this in with you, and this is something which actually ties in with what Dr. Mahmoud mentioned. So you could both address this, inshallah, at some point. But first yourself. Mahin Zaman asks, and I believe this is my sort of like dear friend and Boro Bhai, so to speak. Mahin Zaman is a friend of my brother's and a professor in the Midwest, if I recall correctly. So he says, however problematic 1971's Bangladeshi nationalist narrative has been as a de-Islamizing force, it did co-opt a legitimate criticism of inter-ethnic domination by Punjabi elites and other West Pakistanis. That legitimate criticism needs to be a plank for JI and Jamaat Islami and other newer Islamization forces. Both 47 and 71 provide spaces for much of Bengal's Muslim independent formation from West Bengali and West Pakistani hegemonies, which were both in different ways communalist. So I don't know if you want to comment on that, and if you would like to add to the wider discussion.
It was cutting off, or not right now. I saw Mahir Zaman's question, but it was cutting off originally the question to Dr. Rahman and so if you don't mind reminding me.
Sure. So if I recall correctly, we were talking about... No problem. And I hope my memory serves me correctly, but we were talking about the challenge of, or at least Dr. Rafiq was talking about the challenge of democracy and what the next generation needs to do. So in some respects, in the region, he was arguing that, whether it's liberal democracy has kind of been incorporated in certain elements, and the challenges between democracy and autocracy in the Middle East region in particular. And I think that's quite true in many respects. Yeah.
I think, okay, that part, I think the answers were really helpful for me. I will respond to Mahin Zaman's question here. Of course, there was tension that one could say ethnic or etc. between Punjabis and Pakistanis and Bengalis, etc. during the 71. I think the real question is and this is an actual practical question, if you want to have a state that is going to be anti-Indian at the level of security and intelligence apparatus, and this is what the fight is in Bangladesh, it's a fight against Indian domination. At that point, you do have to think about other neighbors who could be helpful in creating and helping and in being part of that process. So in that sense, Pakistan would be a natural ally to think about. So we should not constantly only think about history in the negative sense of how it played out by a particular group of military leaders in Pakistan and so on. The fact remains that in 1947, the Bangladeshi peasantry and Bengalis were deeply invested and interested in the Pakistan movement originally. So there are very other histories, different political tensions emerged, and we have to recognize that as we move through the process of a national reconciliation. I was simply highlighting that to show that there has to be a historical reassessment.
Unfortunately, your sound is gone once again. So, inshallah, can you hear us now? And someone's phone is ringing. So. Okay, so I'm really sorry, Tanzin Bhai. Your line
I can
got
hear
cut
you now,
again.
but
Okay, did you want to finish off that thought, inshallah?
I say answered the question to an extent,
Right.
but if there's other
Right.
questions, ask me.
No, Jazakumullah khairan. I mean, I think the fundamental questions that need to be addressed, and I hope scholars like ourselves can participate in this. I know Dr. Mahmudur Rahman has already written a book on these sorts of themes. So, the book whose title we referred to, and it's in English, published in 2019, and I encourage all of our listeners and viewers to get their hands on history of Bengal. The Unfinished Battle of Faith, I think, is the subtitle. And but I think, and in that book, of course, you go to the early history, going back hundreds of years to this kind of Bengali roots of Islam and the rulership and the gradual conversion of a largely Buddhist nation to Islam through organic sort of processes. But I think this is, an insight which I think is of immense importance. And I wanted to ask you about 71 and 47 as well, but I wanted to situate it in this context, that the creation of those sorts of narratives is an immense task. It's a task that will require the making of films, the making of dramas, the making of, writing of, unearthing of vast archives, and the transmission of, the writing down, documentation of oral histories, and making that Islamic origin and root a source of great inspiration, which is, in my estimation, not difficult to do. Islam is a source of inspiration for nearly 2 billion souls on this planet. But do we have the commitment within our intellectual classes, within our cultural classes? Is the neglect of certain elements of narrative production within Islamically minded peoples to blame as well for this kind of significant regress or significant unequal strength of the narratives, the Islamic versus the kind of the default de facto secularist narrative of the origins of Bangladesh. So Dr. Mahmoud, if it's okay, I will give you the floor for the next few minutes just to reflect on these questions, inshallah. And
I will now focus on 1971 because I haven't talked about 1971 very much. Other contributors were talking about more. Now, to solve this 1971 narrative, you see, this is very important. I agree with Tanzin. That is very, very important to fight against the delegitimization of Islam in Bangladesh, because the main weapon of this Islamophobic group is basically the 1971 story. The three things we need to really clearly tell in the narrative. One is the role of the Pakistani ruling elite, which one of the gentlemen has asked this question, that the role of the elite. But that role of the elite was not necessarily against only the Bengalis. They were exploiting the Baluchis, they were exploiting the Sindhis, they were exploiting even the rural or the poorer section of the Punjabis and the Pathans and Pashtuns. So it was not, the narrative should be challenged that it was only against the ruling elite, were only against the Bengali Muslim population, thus the then East Pakistani population. It's not true. This is not the history. History is the elite were from the exploiter class. So this is one. The second point is the Indian role in the 1971 liberation war of Bangladesh. You see, that has to be clearly stated. It was not a philanthropic move by the Indians. Indians were trying to bifurcate Pakistan from 1947 because, as I said in my opening statement, that Pakistan was the challenger to the aspiration of India to become the hegemonic master of South Asia. So Pakistan was the challenger to that hegemonic aspiration. So India fought two wars in 1947, the first war, and then 1965, but both ended in stalemate. So 1971 was a God-given opportunity for India, which Mrs. Indira Gandhi said that it's an opportunity for 1,000 years. So that was the statement from Indira Gandhi. So India wanted to bifurcate Pakistan. we wanted to we wanted freedom from the Pakistani ruling elite. So it was a sort of a relationship of convenience. It was a win-win situation for India and also for the Bangladeshi, the people, the Bengali people of that time. So we need to factually assess the so-called narrative on gratefulness. You see, always, the Awami League and the so-called secular group, they say that we should remain ever grateful to India for the support of 1971. That is the narrative, basically. We need to challenge that narrative. There is no question of gratefulness. We required assistance from India, and India assisted us for their geopolitical reason, for their geopolitical strategy. So there is no question of gratefulness. So India should also be grateful to us because we gave them the opportunity to bifurcate Pakistan. Because they failed in 1965, they failed in 1947, they succeeded in 1971 to defeat Pakistan army because the Pakistan army at that time was morally weak because of their because of their genocide in East Pakistan. They were morally weak. They were a morally weak fighting force. So it was a great opportunity for India. They took full advantage of that opportunity. It was also an opportunity for us to seek for Indian assistance. It should end there. So this narrative of ever gratefulness, it should stop now. So, and on the JI side, let me just add 1 minute. I will finish it within 1 minute. The JI also, the Jamaat Islami should also clarify their situation of 1971. And I find there is a way of clarifying their situation. They should say that, this is my suggestion, I don't know whether JI will accept or reject it. My suggestion, they should say that we were correct on the political understanding that when we come out of Pakistan, we become independent. How will we become, will remain independent? How we are going to face the Indian hegemony? So that was the concern of the JI at that time, that whether after you dissociate yourself from Pakistan, your secessionist movement becomes successful, will you be able to remain independent? That was the question, the political question of JI. And then JI should say that we are right on political basis, but we were wrong when we supported the Pakistan army. We should have protested the excesses of Pakistan army. We should have protested against the genocide of the Pakistan army, and we are sorry for that. So JI also needs to clarify their 71 position clearly so that we can move forward. And this, once we move forward from 1971, this delegitimization of Islam is going to stop in Bangladesh. So we need to solve this 1971 problem narrative as quickly as possible.
Jazakumullah khairan, Dr. Mahmoud. I think this is a question I'm going to probably have a longer conversation with you at some point about, because one of the questioners actually asked specifically about something. He's quoting my grandfather, so let me just read the question. But he's saying, as Professor Ghulam Azam already articulated the 3 points, first, being majority tends to democracy, not segregation. Second, anti-Indian hegemony. And third, Umma unity in his remarkable book, Polashi Theke Bangladesh and Noya Diganto. Then why does Jamaat not declare its historical stance regarding this issue more boldly? I'm not actually, from my own sort of weakness in Bangla, I'm not familiar with that particular book, but let me maybe suggest this. My grandfather, as you will well know, Professor Ghulam Azam, in an interview in 2010, shortly before he was imprisoned by the fascist regime of Hasina, did give an extensive interview, and he talked about 1971, and he said, well, we were opposed to the hegemony of India, and we were also opposed to the the genocidal behavior of the Pakistani army. So we were trying to tell them not to behave in that way, but we were also concerned that if India were to succeed in bifurcating Pakistan, then Bangladesh would basically be at the mercy of India, and that is what has come about for the last, at that point he was saying, last 40 years. And I think the difference in what you're seeking from JI or Jamaat Islami, for people who would perhaps be less familiar, is that he said this 10 years after he retired as Amir of Jamaat, whereas the institution of Jamaat Islami, as far as I understand, has not commented on this. And so this is something which is, I hope, something that they will think about. I have a great deal of respect for Dr. Shafiqur Rahman, who is the current head of the institution. And I hope that they can resolve this, because it will be an important part of the process of resolving the Islam and politics question in Bangladesh. But I'm really grateful for both of your interventions, all of your interventions so far. I wanted to just come back to you, Dr. Mahmoud, because there was one last question which I wanted to direct to you, and then I'm going to hopefully give each of the other panelists a couple of minutes to give their final thoughts on the session, inshallah. So someone was asking, a question for Dr. Mahmoud: what role will Shahbag play in the new Bangladesh? So, if we're talking about sort of competing tendencies, and Shahbag reflects the kind of, if I am correctly characterizing this, please feel free to correct me, Dr. Mahmoud. But Shahbag reflects the more secularist tendencies within Bangladesh. How will they be thought about?
Yeah, okay. I cannot look into Shahbag in isolation. When we talk about Shahbag, we have to talk about Shapla also, because Shahbag and Shapla are the two sides of the story, of the history of that time. Now, Shahbag, I look into Shahbag is basically a India-sponsored movement supported by Sheikh Hasina regime of that time, just to delegitimize Islam. So their main target of Shahbag was not the JI leaders. Their target, I always maintain that, their target, the Shahbag target, was actually delegitimize Islam and the final victory of secularism based on the narrative of the Bengali nationalism. So that was specifically their target of Shahbag. In that case, naturally the reaction was the Shapla movement, was the Hefazat movement. Because the Hefazat movement, as I said already, so I don't want to repeat, they said that we will not tolerate any insult of our religion and especially of our Prophet Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam. So that was the two sides of the story at that time. Alhamdulillah, after how many years? 11 years, we can see now Shahbag has won. Shahbag has lost and Shapla has won. So that's after 11 years, the history should be written like this, that the Shahbag movement has totally failed. Okay, Shahbag movement for the time being maybe was responsible for the execution of some of the JI leaders. I mean, they instigated the execution of the JI leaders. In that respect, if that is their target, they were successful on that. But as I said, their main target was complete delegitimization of Islam in Bangladesh in politics and the victory of the Bengali nationalism. So that has been defeated, and it is specially defeated by the slogan which Tasnin was saying, that Tumike Amike Rajakar, Rajakar ke boleche, Shoiracha. Who am I and who are you? Razakar, who has said it? The autocrat has said it. So that was basically the slogan. So when the people are now rejecting the narrative of Bengali nationalism, they are rejecting the narrative of the Razakar of 1971. That is the victory of Shapla. So I think Shahbag has lost in the narrative war. So I think that is a great victory. I always expected that there should be political victory over Sheikh Hasina. There should be political defeat of Sheikh Hasina. And now Sheikh Hasina, by taking refuge, by fleeing from Bangladesh and taking refuge to Delhi, she has proven that she has lost in the political war, in the political narrative. Thank you.
Jazakumullah khairan. I hope your optimism with respect to kind of this contest between the Shahbag and Shapla reality is borne out, because of course we're still in that post-revolutionary flux, and so there are still concerns about whether this interim government will succeed in removing the elements, but the broader ummatic sort of concern for the finding these opportunities so important for this ummatic transformation. And I think the August Revolution, this is one of the reasons why we are focusing on this today, is to acknowledge a moment which has great promise, has great risk as well. But I think all of your input has been extremely valuable in reflecting on how we can think about this specifically within Bangladesh, but also in the wider ummatic frame. So in that spirit, I would like to perhaps call this to a conclusion and give both Dr. Rafiq and Dr. Tanzeen perhaps 2 minutes each to say any concluding remarks. We are at 2 hours, so I'd ask you to strictly keep it to 2 minutes. But Dr. Rafiq, if I can perhaps request that you give us any final concluding thoughts on the ummatic dimensions of this.
Thank you, Dr. Osama. Of course, I'm not expert in the Bengali affairs, but just a general point. I think what happened in Bangladesh is very common to the creation of a narrow form of nationalism in the Muslim world, even outside the Muslim world, to create a founding myth as well, an imaginative enemy. And maybe Pakistan is invited in this perspective as the genocide, player as well, the enemy of Bengali nationalism, which is not, accurate. It is not related to the complexity of the reality and the long common history between the Bengalis and Pakistani and the Indian Muslims in the Indian subcontinent as a whole. This is the first point. The second point, I think the dominant narrative to the issue of secularity is that, generally speaking, secularity is deeply associated with what is called enlightenment, democracy, progress, opening of minds and hearts. And I think maybe this is related in a certain aspect to the Western context, in the European, mainly the European context, and even the United States. But looking at the process of secularization and secularity as a whole in the Muslim world, it's completely the inverse. Of course, secularity is very controversial term and concept. Philosophically speaking, if we speak about secularity, it is deeply related to what is designated by Max Weber as this disenchantment of the world, which is, to get rid from all forms of transcendence and belief in the other world. This is very controversial and very complicated, complex, and it is not accepted within an Islamic framework and philosophy. But politically speaking, the process of secularization in the Muslim world is not associated with democracy. It's completely the inverse. It is associated and has been associated with what I called in my PhD a secular despotism, a secular form of despotism, which is imposed in different countries of the Muslim world in the name of secularity or secularization, authoritarianism, political despotism, all forms of dictatorship are legitimized within a secular context against the masses and the majority of the people in the Muslim world. So you have to be aware about the differences of concepts within different, contexts and different history. That's it. And I have to stop here. Thank you very much.
Barakallahu feekum. That's a very important insight, actually. And of course, in the Tunisian context, this is an all-important observation because, as Professor Rashid Al-Nushi points out, the leader of Al-Nahda, that secularism came to our part of the world on the back of tanks, and so it has a very distinct relationship to politics, shall we say, or perhaps an absence thereof. Dr. Tanzeen, you have the final word, inshallah. So if you can be concise, jazakumullah khairan, and hopefully we can hear you, inshallah.
Yeah, thankfully, hopefully, inshallah. Thanks for this opportunity. I would like to thank Ummatics, and I'd like to thank the guests, but particularly Dr. Mahmudur Rahman for joining us and sharing his. I think it will be a revolution. I think.
Unfortunately, we can't hear you. Unfortunately.
Hear me?
Now we can hear you a bit better. I think your internet's been very choppy.
Can you hear me?
Yes.
My internet is saying it's okay. I think the question is, how can we make sure that this is a revolution? How can we make sure that all of us are able to work towards completing that process of making sure that Indian intelligence and Indian security apparatus and Indian border security is not disrupting our lives and that our sovereignty is back? And this is something that all forces, all the different tendencies in Bangladesh or anti-Indian at the level of that security apparatus, that we're able to work together and creating the ground for that. And I think for that, we need people like Mahmudur Rahman to be back in helping the construction of that society. We all have our different roles to play, and we have to make sure that, one of the things is that when the internet activists, meaning the hackers, actually hacked the Bangladeshi government's various websites and Bangladeshi banks and websites like that, they said this is war now after Abu Said was martyred. And I want us to understand that the war is not over, that Indian interests still there.
Unfortunately, we have
Within
lost you again, but
I think that's good.
Unfortunately, we've lost you again, but I think the overall message, alhamdulillah, came through clearly, which is that, to a certain extent, there's a direct message for Dr. Mahmudur Rahman saying that you must somehow directly intervene. May Allah grant you tawfiq, inshallah, and a long and healthy life, inshallah, to be able to make ongoing contributions to Bangladesh as a part of the Islamic Ummah. I believe you're currently based in Turkey, so which is, again, a friendly country to the Ummah and another very important actor within the Ummah. I think, we all have, and you finally gave a call to action, Dr. Tanzeen, which is, I think, part of the Ummatics Colloquium and Ummatics Institute is a call to action to all Ummah-loving workers within people within the Muslim community who have the intellectual resources to make contributions at a level which has been quite often neglected, partly because of the immiseration of the Ummah and the forcing us to really focus on the bare necessities. And to cite a famous German playwright, he said, "Food first, then ethics." And the Ummah has often been very preoccupied about finding food so they can survive. And right now, even in Gaza, people are struggling to find food so that they can survive. But some of us have the responsibility to think about these bigger questions and these systemic questions, and also, inshallah, have the responsibility to contribute in that very direct way. And I really am grateful, actually, especially to have two statesmen, Dr. Mahmudur Rahman and Dr. Rafiq Abdul Salam, who have worked very directly at the coalface to try and address, and I know both of you are still very active in your respective sections of the Ummah to try and have that sort of influence, positive impact. And I hope and pray that we can inspire through your actions and through our participation of the next generation, myself and Dr. Tanzeen, and inshallah inspire future generations of scholars and thinkers to think how we can make that contribution to the Ummah as a whole. So with that, I would like to bring the session to a close and say Jazakumullahu khairan kathiran. And also thanks to Brother Abdurrahman Mashtan and Brother Abdullah in the background, who have been patient with me for going over for 8 minutes. But inshallah, we look forward to staying in touch with all of you in the near future. سبحانك اللهم وبحمدك نشهد أن لا إله إلا أنت نستغفرك ونتوب إليك. السلام عليكم ورحمة الله وبركاته.